Imagine a time before refrigerators. No gentle hum of a machine in the corner. No cool shelves filled with milk, fruit, or leftovers. Instead, you live in a world where the heat of summer presses down each day, where food spoils quickly if left in the open, and where every meal is a race against time. This was the daily reality for ancient people who had to find ways to preserve their food long before electricity or iceboxes were even imagined. From the moment they gathered harvest from the fields or pulled fish from the river, the question was urgent. How do we make this last? Without a solution, bread grew stale, meat spoiled, fruit softened into rot. Hunger was never far away, and so human creativity rose to meet the challenge. Across the world, people dug deep cellars into the earth, packed jars tightly with oil or honey, salted fish until it was hard as stone, smoked meat over slow fires, and learned to dry fruits beneath the sun. Some even carved blocks of ice from frozen rivers in winter and stored them in pits, covered with straw, to keep through the summer months. Every culture discovered its own methods, shaped by climate, resources, and tradition. What seems ordinary to us today, a pantry, a storage jar, a cool cellar, was once a vital invention, the difference between survival and famine. These methods were not just about keeping food edible. They shaped diets, trade, even the rhythms of daily life. Salt became more valuable than gold in certain times. Spices traveled across continents, and families built their routines around preserving enough food to survive the lean months. Tonight, we will step into that world. We will explore the quiet, ingenious methods that ancient people used to preserve their food without refrigerators. We will imagine cool underground chambers lined with jars, the steady smoke of fires drying. Meat, the tang of salted fish, the sweetness of dried figs stored for winter. We will walk slowly through these forgotten rhythms, seeing how ordinary people turned fragile harvests into lasting nourishment. So settle in. Let the noise of your own world fade, and prepare for a journey into the calm ingenuity of the past. And if you enjoy wandering through these forgotten corners of history, remember to like and subscribe so these quiet stories can find you again. Life in the ancient world was always lived with an awareness that food could not be trusted to last. From the moment a loaf of bread was pulled from the oven or a fish was taken from the river, time was already ticking. The air itself seemed to work against preservation. The warmth of the sun, the dampness of rain, the endless hunger of insects, and the invisible spread of decay all conspired to make each meal fleeting. People could not set aside baskets of fruit and expect them to remain sweet for long. They could not kill an animal and simply assume its meat would stay fresh. They could not pour milk and return to it later in the day. Everything spoiled. Everything was fragile. And so the ancient world carried within it an endless awareness that food was always at risk. That each day brought with it a quiet struggle against hunger. When dawn broke over a village or city, people rose not only to greet the sun, but to begin again this battle with time. Bakers set their dough to rise in the hours before light, knowing that bread baked in the morning would rarely last into the following day. Fishermen rushed to bring their catch into the markets, calling out to buyers before the heat of noon turned their prize into waste. Farmers picked vegetables carefully, selling or cooking them immediately, lest they soften and sour by the next sunrise. Housewives stirred pots not with the intention of leftovers, but with the careful eye of someone who knew that anything uneaten would likely become unsafe by nightfall. There was no concept of storing for later, unless one had taken specific, practiced steps to preserve. The idea that food could wait was a luxury of another world. Far in the future, the struggle was constant, and it shaped not only how food was handled, but how life itself was lived. Families gathered close to their meals, eating together, finishing what was prepared. Waste was not only frowned upon, but dangerous. To throw away spoiled food was to admit defeat against time. to lose a portion of the harvest or the catch that might mean the difference between comfort and hunger. Illness, too, was a lurking danger. Meat left too long in the warmth, bread left damp, fruit too soft to eat, all carried risks that people understood through hard experience. Generations passed down knowledge of smells, textures, and signs. The sourness of milk, the sharp odor of fish, the discoloration of meat. These were warnings. People learned to listen to their senses, to trust their instincts, to guard themselves against the unseen dangers that spoiled food carried with it. The climate added to the challenge. In hot regions, preservation was almost impossible without careful methods. Fish turned quickly, meat grew sour, fruit collapsed into mush. In cooler lands, food lasted longer, but damp air brought its own dangers. Mold growing on bread, rot creeping into grains, frost destroying fresh produce stored unwisely. The seasons, too, played their part. In summer, food spoiled fast. In winter, shortages loomed if preservation had failed. Spring brought abundance, but also urgency, as new harvests meant old stores had to be used before they rotted. Autumn was a race against time, a flurry of drying, salting, smoking, and storing, all in preparation for the long months when fresh food would not be available. Each season carried its own rhythm, its own risks, its own lessons. This daily fragility of food shaped the entire rhythm of ancient life. Markets opened not only as places of trade, but as urgent centers of exchange where goods had to move quickly. The fisherman's call at dawn was not only commerce, but survival, a plea to move his catch before the sun destroyed it. The farmer's stall brimmed with fresh greens, but only for the hours of the morning. By evening, much of it would be gone, either eaten or spoiled. The baker's bread, fragrant and warm in the early hours, grew hard and stale by nightfall, destined either for animals or the fire if not consumed. Time pressed on every item, every bite, every meal. Children grew up with this awareness. They learned quickly not to ask for yesterday's milk, not to expect fruit to taste the same after sitting out in the heat, not to leave bread exposed on the table. They watched their parents test foods with their hands and noses, saw the rituals of preservation repeated again and again. They learned to help, carrying small baskets of herbs, spreading fruits in the sun to dry, watching smoke rise from meat hung above the fire. From their earliest years, children understood that food was fleeting, that survival was tied to vigilance, and that preservation was as important as harvest itself. Hunger hovered always near. A spoiled harvest, a ruined storehouse, or a few days of bad weather could shift a family from comfort to fear. Communities celebrated not only abundance, but safety. Jars sealed tightly against damp, sacks of grain stored high and dry, smoked meat hanging ready for winter. These were signs not of luxury, but of survival. Preservation was not an afterthought. It was a foundation of life. Without it, there could be no certainty, no endurance through the changing seasons. And yet, even with all their methods, even with all their vigilance, the ancients lived with an acceptance of fragility. They knew that food was a gift, a temporary blessing, one that demanded care each day. They understood waste as danger, spoilage as a constant threat, hunger as something never far away. Their lives remind us of a truth we too easily forget, that food is not eternal, that abundance is fragile, that survival depends on awareness. Today, when we open refrigerators and find food waiting days or weeks after purchase, it is easy to imagine that freshness is ordinary. But for ancient people, freshness was fleeting, and preservation was the only barrier between nourishment and emptiness. Each day was a quiet struggle with time, each meal a triumph against decay, each successful act of preservation a victory that carried them forward. To walk in their world is to remember the fragility of nourishment, the care that every bite required, and the patience with which they fought against the invisible hand of spoilage. Their story begins here, in the endless struggle to keep food safe, in the constant awareness that life itself rested on the thin line between preservation and loss. If we close our eyes and step into the daily world of the ancients, we find ourselves surrounded not by the conveniences we know today, but by fragile abundance. Food that could vanish into spoilage at any hour. For this reason, one of humanity's earliest and most practical inventions was not a weapon or even a tool of agriculture, but the humble cellar. Across civilizations, from villages carved into the earth to grand villas with carefully built storage chambers, the earth itself became the ally of people who needed to protect what they harvested. Cool, dark, steady, the underground was a silent guardian, a natural refrigerator long before the idea of mechanical cooling had been born. To understand how food survived in the ancient world, we must first descend those stone steps, must lower our bodies into the damp earth, must pause in the shadows where jars, baskets, and sacks once rested in quiet safety. Picture yourself in a modest ancient home. Above ground, the heat of the day is already pressing against the walls, filling the air with the buzzing of insects and the sharp scents of dust and sweat. But beneath the floor, a trapdoor opens to darkness. A ladder or a few carved steps lead downward, the air cooling as you descend. The smell changes too. Earth, damp, faintly sweet with stored grain or fruit. Down here, away from the sun, food waits. Clay jars line the walls, sealed with lids of stone or wax. Baskets are stacked carefully, filled with onions, garlic, beans. Amphorae rest in the corners, their long necks sealed, holding wine or oil or water that will not spoil as quickly in the cool. This underground room is simple, yet it holds the key to survival. The earth is steady in its temperature, far less fickle than the air above. In summer, when the heat makes food spoil quickly, the underground remains cool, slowing the growth of mold, slowing the invasion of insects, slowing the relentless march of decay. In winter, when frost might destroy harvests left above ground, the cellar holds a softer cold, never warm but never freezing, protecting roots and grains from damage. The walls, made of stone or clay, absorb moisture and release it slowly, creating a balance that keeps produce firm and edible longer. For ancient people, the cellar was not merely a room. It was a companion, a trusted guardian, a place where the fragile gift of food could be stretched beyond its natural limits, i.e. in the countryside. Farmers often built their storage chambers beneath their houses, so they could descend at dawn or dusk to retrieve what they needed. These cellars were usually low, sometimes no taller than a man could stand, with shelves carved directly into the earth or planks laid across stones. Torches or small lamps lit the darkness briefly as people worked, careful not to linger too long in the smoke-filled air. Children were sent to fetch onions or beans, their small hands learning the layout of jars in the half-dark. Women kept track of what was stored, making notes in memory, counting how many baskets remained, how many amphorae were still sealed. Men dug deeper when needed, expanding the chamber, adding a new alcove, reinforcing walls with wood. These were living spaces of survival, shaped by hands and passed down through generations. In cities, the cellars grew more complex. Beneath villas and townhouses, wealthy families constructed elaborate underground chambers, sometimes with multiple rooms, sometimes with vaulted ceilings that allowed better airflow. Slaves or servants carried goods down steep staircases, stacking amphorae of wine, oil, and grain in rows. Cool stone benches held cheese and jars of dried fruit. In some cases, underground streams or cisterns added natural moisture, keeping the air damp enough to protect certain foods from drying out. These cellars were not only practical, but symbols of wealth, for to have food preserved and waiting was to display abundance. Guests invited to dine above knew that beneath their feet lay safety against hunger, a treasure trove of nourishment waiting in the earth. Even larger were the communal storerooms. In some regions, entire villages shared underground chambers, dug beneath central buildings, where grain and other staples could be kept safe for the community. These were guarded carefully, for they represented life itself through the long months of winter or the uncertain years of poor harvest. Elders measured out portions, deciding how much could be spared, how much must remain sealed. To descend into these communal cellars was to step into a vault of survival, a place where the fate of many families rested on the strength of walls and the vigilance of guardians. Imagine standing inside such a chamber on a hot day. Above, the city buzzes with life. Children playing, animals braying, vendors shouting in the market. But here underground, all is still. Your breath echoes softly. The flame of your lamp flickers gently against the walls. You hear only the faint dripping of water, the rustle of grain shifting in sacks, the distant sound of footsteps from the world above. The air is cool against your skin, carrying with it the scent of earth, the faint sharpness of onions, the sweet tang of stored apples. You feel as if time itself moves slower here, as if the rush of decay has been held at bay by the steady patience of stone. And indeed, that is what the cellar did. It slowed time. Not forever, not completely, but enough. Enough for fruit to last weeks instead of days. Enough for grain to remain edible until the next harvest. Enough for cheese to ripen slowly instead of collapsing into spoilage. Enough for wine to mellow and grow rich in the cool dark. In a world where everything above ground was fragile, below ground became a place of endurance. The ingenuity of these spaces lay not only in their construction, but in the knowledge of how to use them. Ancient people learned what foods could rest together and what must be separated. Fruits that released moisture were kept apart from grains that would mold. Strong-smelling foods like garlic or onions were stored in baskets with open air around them, so their scent did not spread too widely. Amphorae were sealed tightly with resin or wax, their mouths covered to keep out insects. Jars were labeled not with writing for many, but with memory. Families knew which container held which food, passed down in the minds of mothers and daughters who remembered placement as carefully as recipes. Some cellars even became places of transformation. Cheese ripened here, slowly developing flavor in the damp coolness. Wine aged in its amphorae, turning deeper and stronger over time. Fermented foods thrived in the underground quiet, bubbles rising slowly in jars, flavors deepening. These cellars were not only places of storage, but laboratories of tradition, where food became more than itself, changed by time, guided by patience. There was beauty, too, in these spaces, though humble. The light of a lamp reflecting off the curve of a clay jar. The neat rows of amphorae stretching into the shadows. The smell of dried herbs hanging from beams, filling the air with quiet fragrance. The feeling of cool stone beneath the hand, rough and solid, steady in a world where little was steady. To step into a cellar was to step into a sanctuary, a space where the relentless fragility of life found a moment of peace. But there was also risk. A damp wall could collapse. Rats could find their way into sacks of grain, gnawing holes that destroyed months of food. Mold could creep unseen, spreading through stores until an entire harvest was lost. Families lived with these fears, checking often, inspecting, repairing, guarding. Cellars were both hope and hazard, safety and uncertainty, requiring constant vigilance. A spoiled jar meant not only wasted food, but danger for the winter ahead. And so, these spaces were visited daily, their darkness lit by many lamps, their contents watched with patient eyes. Today, when we walk among ruins, we often overlook these underground spaces. The grand columns and temples catch our attention, but beneath them lie the silent cellars, often collapsed, their walls hidden, their memory forgotten. Yet for the ancients, these were as important as any monument. They were the quiet foundation of life, the uncelebrated guardians of survival. Without them, abundance would vanish in days. With them, food endured long enough to carry families and communities through lean times. As you imagine the world before refrigeration, picture again the coolness of the cellar. Picture the feeling of descending into shadow, of touching stone walls, of smelling the mingled scents of fruit, grain, and earth. Picture the patient jars, sealed and waiting. Picture the baskets stacked in corners, the amphorae lined neatly, the silence holding everything together. And let yourself feel what they must have felt: a deep gratitude, a quiet relief, a fragile trust in the earth itself to protect what was most precious. Because in the end, these cool underground storages were not only practical, they were symbols of endurance, of the human ability to adapt, to use the natural world to defend against hunger. They remind us that even without machines, without technology, our ancestors found ways to survive, to preserve, to endure. And in their shadows, in their damp stone walls, their story still lingers, waiting like the food they once held, safe, quiet. When we imagine the survival of food in the ancient world, we must imagine not only the people who grew it or the earth that sheltered it, but the vessels that held it safe. The story of preservation is also the story of containers, clay jars with broad shoulders and narrow necks, amphorae carried across seas, sealed pots buried in earth, simple baskets hardened with wax or resin to resist damp. Without containers, abundance spilled away. With them, harvest could be stretched, liquids carried, goods traded. In the ancient world, the vessel itself was as valuable as its contents, for it allowed food to last longer than nature intended. To step into a market or a storeroom was to see not only fruits, grains, oils, and wines, but endless rows of jars, amphorae, and sealed containers, each one a silent guardian of nourishment. Clay was the material of choice, abundant and adaptable, shaped by human hands into countless forms. Across civilizations, potters worked at wheels or with simple coils, smoothing and shaping vessels with practiced care. They knew the curves that held liquids best, the thickness that resisted cracks, the glazes that sealed pores. A jar was not simply a jar. It was a decision, a craft, a choice that determined how long its contents would endure. Wide-mouthed jars allowed easy filling of grain or fruit, while narrow-necked amphorae protected oils and wines from too much air. Flat bases suited cellars and storerooms, while pointed ends allowed amphorae to be stuck upright in racks on ships or buried partly in the ground. Each design reflected purpose, refined through generations, tested by survival. Imagine a potter at work. His hands are stained with clay, his wheel spinning steadily as he shapes a vessel that will one day hold olives or honey. The walls rise beneath his fingers, smooth and even, his eyes steady, his touch precise. Around him, finished jars stand drying in the sun, their surfaces pale, awaiting the fire of the kiln that will harden them into permanence. Nearby, other jars already finished gleam faintly with a coating of resin or wax, their mouths sealed with lids of clay or stone. To make a container was to make a promise that what was harvested in the abundance of summer would remain safe in the scarcity of winter, that the sweetness of figs or the strength of oil would endure beyond their natural span. The amphora, with its tall body and twin handles, became one of the most iconic vessels of the ancient world. Seen in shipwrecks at the bottom of the sea, stacked in warehouses of great cities, lined in rows in markets and homes, amphorae carried the essentials of life: oil, wine, water, grain, fish sauce. They were both practical and symbolic. To see a storeroom full of amphorae was to see wealth, abundance, security. To receive one as a trade good was to gain not only its contents but the trust that it had been sealed, protected, preserved. Ships crossing seas carried hundreds of amphorae in their holds, wedged together, their pointed ends resting in sand or racks, their necks sealed with resin and covered with stoppers of wood or clay. When opened weeks or months later, the goods inside remained safe, proof of the vessel's worth. But amphorae and jars were not only for transport. They were central to daily preservation. Families kept them in cool corners of houses or buried partly in the ground. Some jars were lined with pitch to keep liquids from seeping, others with honey to add sweetness and seal. Lids were pressed down with clay and marked with the handprint of the maker or the owner. In some cases, jars were buried entirely, hidden in pits, their contents meant to last for months unseen. To open such a jar was to open not only food, but time itself, to taste the summer months later in the depth of winter. Consider the small gestures of daily life around these containers. A woman removes the lid from a jar of dried figs, their sweetness still intact, the smell of sun lingering even in the cool shadows of a cellar. A boy dips a ladle into a tall amphora, drawing out oil that glistens golden in the light. A merchant pries open the stopper of a jar of grain, running it through his fingers to test its dryness. A traveler accepts a sealed amphora of water, knowing it will remain clean and drinkable through days of journeying. Each gesture is simple, yet each relies on the silent work of clay and seal, on the container's ability to hold back the decay that always pressed from outside. The artistry of sealing was as important as the container itself. A jar unsealed was a jar wasted. People used wax, resin, cloth tied with cord, clay stoppers pressed firm, even layers of ash or sand packed tightly on top. They knew that air was the enemy, that insects and moisture slipped through the smallest gaps. The act of sealing became a ritual, done with care, with patience. A father teaching his son to press wax around the rim. A mother showing her daughter how to tie cloth tight with cord. These were skills as important as cooking or planting, for without them, food vanished. The variety of containers reflected the variety of needs. Large storage jars, heavy and broad, sat unmoving in storerooms, their size making them immovable, but their capacity immense. Smaller jars traveled to markets, carried by hand or cart. Amphorae crossed seas and rivers, their durability tested by waves and storms. Tiny pots held spices, herbs, or medicine, precious goods that needed extra care. Each vessel had its place, each design its story. In every household, in every market, in every ship, the silent presence of jars and amphorae formed the backbone of preservation. The sound of such vessels filled daily life. The scrape of a lid lifted, the hollow echo of grain poured into clay, the faint glug of oil drawn from an amphora, the dull thud of a jar set down on stone. These sounds were ordinary yet profound, reminders that survival was always in the details, always in the hands that sealed and unsealed containers with care. In the silence of a cellar, in the bustle of a market, in the sway of a ship's hold, these sounds carried reassurance, the promise that food would endure, that hunger would wait, that life would go on. Over centuries, these containers became so much a part of life that they were rarely thought of, yet they shaped everything. Trade routes existed because amphorae could carry wine and oil across seas without spoilage. Families endured winters because jars of dried fruit and sealed grain remained edible. Armies marched because provisions were carried in vessels sturdy enough to last through campaigns. The amphora and the jar were not only tools. They were foundations of civilization. Today, when we see their broken forms in museums or scattered fragments in the soil, we see only shards of clay, silent and still. But in their time, they were alive with use, filled with the weight of grain, the scent of oil, the tang of wine. They were lifted, carried, sealed, opened, used daily, touched by countless hands. To walk among them in the ancient world was to walk among guardians of survival, each one holding the fragile gift of preservation. As we imagine the world before refrigeration, let us not forget the vessels. The amphorae standing tall in ships' holds, the jars resting in cellars, the sealed containers buried in earth. They were as important as the food they held, as essential as the harvest itself. They turned abundance into endurance, fragility into security, daily life into survival. Among all the discoveries that shaped how humanity survived without refrigerators, one stood above nearly every other: salt. A simple crystal, small and ordinary to the eye, yet powerful enough to transform fragile, short-lived food into something that could endure. To the ancients, salt was more than a seasoning. It was a shield, a guardian, a silent protector that stood between abundance and hunger, between survival and loss. When harvests came in, when fish were caught, when animals were slaughtered, salt was the difference between fleeting nourishment and lasting sustenance. Entire communities built their routines around it. Entire trade routes depended on it, and entire empires understood that without salt, the rhythm of life would falter. Imagine standing in a small ancient village on the coast. Fishermen return with their catch, the sunlight glinting off scales still wet from the sea. Without salt, these fish would spoil within hours, their flesh softening, their smell turning sharp. But with salt, the story changes. The fish are cleaned, split open, and packed layer upon layer in wooden tubs. Between each layer, handfuls of coarse salt are spread, grains falling like tiny stones, sinking into flesh, drawing out moisture. Soon, the fish are firm, their juices replaced with the silent crystal's protection. Days later, weeks later, even months later, the fish will still be edible, safe to eat, their flavor strong but enduring. In this simple act, salt has stretched the fragile gift of food into time itself. The same scene repeats in countless places. A farmer slaughters a pig in the cool of autumn. Without salt, the meat would rot before winter set in. But with salt rubbed deep into the flesh, packed tightly into barrels, the meat hardens, its decay halted. Families will cut pieces from it throughout the cold months, cooking them slowly, savoring not only the taste but the safety that salt has given them. A shepherd gathers milk in summer, turning some into cheese. Salt is added, sprinkled into curds, pressed into wheels. The cheese matures, firming, safe for months, its flavor deepened, its survival secured. Salt works silently, invisibly, its crystals locking away time, its power woven into every bite. The ancients understood this power intimately. They did not speak of it in scientific terms, but they lived its truth daily. Salt drew out moisture, and with it, the chance for rot. Salt kept insects at bay, made flesh unappealing to decay, created barriers that bacteria could not easily cross. Salt transformed food not by disguising it, but by preserving it, holding it steady against the relentless march of spoilage. In its presence, families felt relief, comfort, endurance. Without it, they felt fear. Because of this, salt became more than a kitchen staple. It became wealth. Mines, marshes, and coasts where salt could be gathered became centers of prosperity. Traders carried sacks of salt across deserts, along rivers, through mountains. Armies marched with salt rations, ensuring their food lasted beyond fresh supplies. Markets thrived not only on grain and oil but on salt, measured carefully, sold at prices that sometimes outweighed even gold. People paid wages in salt, offered gifts of salt, made agreements sealed with salt. To possess salt was to possess security, and to lack it was to be left exposed to hunger. Picture the harvest season in an ancient city. The fields yield grain, the orchards give fruit, the hunters bring back animals. Families gather in courtyards, working together to preserve what they can. Jars of fruit are dried, meat is smoked over fires, but always, salt is present. Hands sprinkle it generously, pressing it into meat, mixing it into cheese, scattering it over fish. The air smells sharp, the crystals crunch beneath feet. The sight of white grains spread across tables brings relief. Children learn early the feel of it, the way it sticks to damp fingers, the way it bites on the tongue. They do not think of it as luxury, but as life itself. For without it, their winter stores would vanish. The silence of salt's work is striking. It does not shout, does not glow, does not move. It simply rests, small and unnoticed, yet within its stillness lies strength. Families could sleep at night knowing the salted meat hanging in their homes would not betray them. Fishermen could travel inland, bringing their catch preserved with salt, selling it far from the sea. Armies could march with salted rations, their strength secured not by fresh markets, but by the silent crystals packed into their provisions. Salt made distance possible, made endurance possible, made civilization itself stronger. Yet salt was not infinite, and its scarcity gave it power. In some regions, people scraped it from dried marshes, gathering crystals left by the sun. In others, they dug deep mines, carving tunnels into the earth, bringing out blocks of salt heavy on their backs. Along coasts, they evaporated seawater in shallow pools, watching as the sun left behind white crusts that were scraped and gathered. Each method was labor, effort, sweat. And so salt was valued, protected, sometimes fought over. Its possession meant stability. Its absence meant fragility. The stories of salt are endless, but they all return to the same truth. It was a silent protector. It needed no ceremony, no spectacle. It simply did its work, day after day, preserving, protecting, enduring. A jar of salted olives, a barrel of salted meat, a sack of salted fish, a wheel of salted cheese. These were not luxuries, but necessities, quiet triumphs against time. Families measured their security in them. Communities measured their strength. Traders measured their wealth. Even today, when we see salt scattered casually on food, it is easy to forget its history. Easy to forget the countless hands that once treasured it, the journeys made to gather it, the lives secured by its presence. But if we pause, if we look back, we can see the quiet dignity of salt's role. We can see how it guarded against hunger, how it gave people time, how it stood between life and loss. To walk in the ancient world was to walk in a world where salt was always near, in kitchens, in markets, in storerooms, in ships. To see its crystals was to feel reassurance. To taste them was to taste safety. It was, and remains, the most silent of protectors, ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in power. And as you imagine those ancient families, those fishermen, those farmers, remember the small grains they trusted. Remember the way they sprinkled it, pressed it, stored with it, lived with it. Remember that in every jar, in every barrel, in every salted meal, the invisible hand of survival was always present, and its name was salt. Close your eyes and picture those jars in the cellar, those racks in the smokehouse, those pits beneath the earth. Picture the patience of waiting, the relief of opening, the gratitude of eating. Let the silence of those spaces wrap around you, steady and cool. Let the story of preservation, of salt, of smoke, of sun, of earth, become a lullaby. For in the end, it is not only the story of food. It is the story of humanity's endurance, humanity's patience, humanity's quiet strength. And in that story, we find comfort, calm, and rest.